I had the chance to talk about all this when I spoke with Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner yesterday afternoon. We sat down just before he met with top General Motors executives to get back their government bailout money, so Geithner was in a pretty good mood. He was also optimistic about getting Democrats and Republicans to agree on a financial reform package, which he believes will guarantee an end to future bailouts paid for by all of us. That's where we began.
I think we will, yeah. I mean, again, I'm spending a huge amount of time up there, both sides of the aisle, a lot of time with Republicans too, and people I talk to want to be for a strong bill. Not just, everybody says they're for reform now, George, because you can't be against reform given what happened. But what matters is, are they going to be for strong reforms? And again, based on what I've heard and what they tell me, they want to be for strong reforms.
There are a lot of people that are questioning whether what you're pushing for is strong enough. I mean, you've got a situation now where the 6 biggest banks in the country have assets equal to more than 60% of the GDP. Why shouldn't those big banks be broken up?
This is a very strong package of reforms. It's going to set limits we've never had in place on risk-taking across the system. Limits on how large firms can be and how risky they can be. You know, we've been doing this for 14 months. There's enormous resistance still across the U.S. financial community and by large institutions around the world to what we're trying to work through.
Yet they're fighting it at a time when these banks are just making staggering profits. I mean, Goldman Sachs, 27% profits. You can't find a business where you make profits at that level, and it's a sure sign, isn't it, that there's not enough competition?
No, I don't believe that. But I think most of what you're seeing now, George, in the American economy is, again, the economy is really getting stronger. I mean, the economy is growing again. Private investment is expanding. People are starting to spend more. Exports are growing, and that's a good sign. It's a healthy sign. But again, we're still living with the financial system that brought us this crisis. And so we have a huge obligation, I believe, huge responsibility now to make sure we're putting in place tough reforms now.
But why isn't it a good idea to do something about the size of these banks? Aren't they still too big to fail?
We agree. Our view is absolutely. And our view is that we need to make sure that you're limiting how big they can get and how risky they can get. But if in the future, if they mess up, and they take themselves to the edge of the cliff again, then we want to make sure we can put them out of existence, dismember them, break them up safely without the American taxpayer having to bail them out again. That's very important. That's a critical part of this bill.
So you're confident that if these reforms are put in place and 18 months down the road we face another situation like Lehman Brothers, whether it's now Citigroup or JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, whichever bank, you take your pick, Goldman Sachs, you're confident that the government will not step in and save them?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's very important for people to understand, because you can't run a system in which private investors or their executives can take risk on the expectation the government's going to come in and protect them. That's a recipe for disaster.
But that's what's been happening, isn't it?
That's what happened before, and we're not going to let that happen again.
Let's talk a little bit about Goldman Sachs. You saw the SEC is taking action against Goldman Sachs. Did anyone in the Obama administration, in Treasury, in the White House, in the government, get any heads up?
Absolutely not.
Nothing.
And again, that could never happen, should never happen. It's a fully independent agency. And they gave no warnings, no notice, no heads up. And there should be no involvement by any person in the executive branch ever in those kind of investigations. And I'm very confident our system protects against that risk.
And I know you can't talk about the investigation per se, but how about the underlying issue? You know, these firms are setting up what are called synthetic CDOs, collateralized debt obligations. These are just bets. Why should firms who are getting backing of the federal government be allowed to do this at all? We end up paying, don't we?
Let me do it slightly differently, because again, I want to be careful. There's an important tradition of not commenting on enforcement of vacancy or their merits. But what you need to have is a system in which this stuff happens not in the dark, where some people can make some money, but it comes at enormous risk to the system as a whole. But we bring derivatives out of the dark. Those types of activities happen in broad daylight with full disclosure, and with the cops able to police this stuff more effectively.
I understand that for private firms, but when you've got these banks who are getting so many subsidies from the federal government, why should they be allowed to do this?
You're exactly right. It is an obligation of government. And in some ways, this was the failure of the system we had, that we had in place for 70 years after the Great Depression, but the markets just outgrew it. The obligation of government is to prevent firms from taking risks that could imperil the economy, and to prevent people from taking advantage of their customers.
But even as Washington limits these risky investments, Wall Street is trying to create new ones. The latest, letting people bet on box office results, a futures market in movies. Do you think that's a good idea?
You know, here's what I think about this, George. The financial sector will be creative and will innovate and will come up with products that meet some real need people have, and to also come up with products which are designed to help people bet on some basic outcome. That's going to happen. It's a necessary part of running a good financial system, but those things come with risks. And our job, our obligation is to make sure that we're reducing those risks, we can contain the damage when those financial innovations go awry. And again, you need the government equipped to do a better job earlier, preemptively, to limit the risks that come with innovation.
So they shouldn't be banned.
But you can't stop innovation. You can't run a system where you have a bunch of bureaucrats in Washington trying to figure out what's risky, what's not, because the risk is they'll miss it, they'll be too late, or they'll overdo it. So the best thing we can do for the country is to make sure the system just has better protections in place when innovations go a little too far.
Mr. Secretary, thanks very much.
Nice to see you, George.